Welcome to Oracle Eyes. Russia is experiencing one of its deadliest days since President Vladimir Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russian casualties are mounting by the day, and Russian troops are struggling to maintain their effectiveness. Moscow has lost large numbers of troops and equipment as Kyiv has launched a counter-offensive to retake occupied territory, and fighting has intensified in Avdiivka, an industrial center in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk region. While the area near Avdiivka, where the Russian army has been attacking in recent days, has been one of the hottest areas on the front, according to the latest information, the Russians are facing a heavy defeat in the Avdiivka direction. Russia's 1st and 2nd armies faced the heaviest defeats in the region. Figures released the day before by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine show that Russia has lost 330 military personnel in the last 24 hours, bringing the total number of Russian casualties since February 24, 2022, to nearly 320,000. More than 800 of these casualties are from the Donetsk-Avdiivka area. While Russian forces are trying to encircle and capture the city of Avdiivka, Ukrainian troops continue their intense offensive to prevent this. Reactive artillery groups of the 59th Motorized Infantry Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, operating in the direction of Avdiivka, are supporting the soldiers fighting on the front line. The groups are firing Grad multi-barrel rocket launchers at the positions of the Russian forces, according to coordinates received from military intelligence. For several weeks, 7 or 8 Russian regiments and brigades of up to 2,000 soldiers each have been trying to surround and isolate Avdiivka, one of the best defended cities in a free Ukraine. Every day the Russians disperse in long columns of tanks and combat vehicles. Every day they step on mines, wander through missile disposal zones, miss artillery fire, and fall victim to explosive-laden drones. Ukrainian and Russian casualties have soared since October, when Russia launched its biggest offensive in months to seize Avdiivka, pouring in thousands of troops, tanks, and armored vehicles. Moscow is said to have amassed around 40,000 troops for a new assault on the town, considered the gateway to Donetsk city. The number of Russian troops, which Kiev's military says has been liquidated in the war, has gradually risen from between 300 and 600 a day since early July to between 600 and 1,000 since early October, coinciding with Moscow's Avdiivka offensive. The Kremlin largely miscalculated in Avdiivka, which it targeted for its symbolic value. 2 weeks after the bloody operation, all Avdiivka represents is dead Russians and smashed Russian tanks. In an intelligence update last month, the UK Defense Ministry said Russia had probably sent elements of 8 brigades to Avdiivka, which suffered some of Russia's highest casualty rates in 2023. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also said last month that Moscow had lost at least 1 brigade trying to capture the strategic town. According to open sources, a Russian brigade can consist of between 2,000 and 8,000 personnel. Russia's 1st and 2nd armies were based in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Russia's 1st Army is mostly made up of traitors from the Donetsk region, while the 2nd Army is made up of pro-Russian traitors from Luhansk. However, their offensive attempts in Avdiivka, Kupiansk, and Bakhmut were epically thwarted by the Ukrainian army. The 1st and 2nd armies of the Russian armed forces in Ukraine have suffered the heaviest and most shameful defeats in history. In its latest update on the conflict, the US-based think tank Institute for the Study of War said Russian sources made unconfirmed claims on Wednesday that Russian forces continued to advance around Avdiivka. Last week, the head of Ukraine's Southern Forces Group, General Oleksandr Tarnavsky, said troops around Avdiivka were resolutely maintaining their defense. If the Russians kept pushing the regiments towards the meat factory in Avdiivka, they could eventually take the town. But the losses they suffered weakened Russia's operations along Ukraine's 600-mile front line. As long as this high casualty rate can be maintained, it becomes possible to suppress Russia's ability to train sufficient numbers of new forces to meet the standards required for effective offensive action. Accordingly, after several days of fighting in Avdiivka, Putin dramatically changed his rhetoric in order to dampen expectations of a military operation by the Russian armed forces on this part of the front. The head of the Russian Federation said nothing about his army's offensive in Ukraine, but made it clear that his army was waging defensive battles in the directions of Zaporizhzhia, Kupiansk, and Avdiivka. Analysts drew attention to Putin's words about active defense instead of active combat operations. In this way, the president of the Russian Federation is trying to dampen Russian expectations about possible future victories of the Russian armed forces. It seems that the Russians are already preparing for the worst. At the same time, analysts noted that the activity of the Russian army in the Avdiivka direction has decreased. It has become impossible for the Russian army to completely encircle Avdiivka, having suffered too many losses both in terms of military operations, manpower, and military hardware. On the other hand, Ukrainian military forces are going on the offensive and making progress in the Russian-occupied territories. This is also seen as a signal of Ukraine's intention to make a more aggressive effort to retake Crimea. According to both Ukrainian and Russian officials, Ukrainian troops have infiltrated the eastern bank of the Dnipro River in the Kherson region of southern Ukraine. As you may recall, the region was one of the 4 regions annexed by Russia in September 2022, following what the West called a sham referendum. Kherson, in particular, has been the focus of occasional fights between the two sides. Ukrainian officials say Russia evacuated its troops from the region in November 2022 and March this year, but has maintained a presence through strong acts of self-defense. Vladimir Saldo, the Kremlin-appointed governor of Kherson, said on Telegram on Wednesday that small groups of Ukrainian militants had been observed in the village of Krinky for some time, and that they had sent too much manpower for our means of destruction to handle. Andriy Yermak, who heads the Ukrainian presidential office, said he has a more optimistic view of his country's military strategy, noting that this progress and strategy has increased the likelihood of retaking the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia annexed in 2014. Despite everything, the Ukrainian Defense Forces have gained a foothold on the left bank of the Dnieper. Yermak also told the Hudson Institute think tank in the United States, "Step by step, they are demilitarizing Crimea. We have covered 70% of the distance, and our counterattack is developing. The Russian army, which is unable to overcome the squeeze at the front, is almost sending its soldiers to slaughter. When we look at all these losses, we can understand that more and more Russian military casualties are being sent to their deaths due to the whims of their incompetent and cynical administrators. At the same time, experts have noted the gradual decline of Russia's artillery systems and logistical capabilities. It remains to be seen whether Russia will be able to maintain its defenses and its capacity to increase its firepower against Ukrainian forces in new strongholds. On the other hand, while the counteroffensive has not brought Ukraine major territorial gains as quickly as some had expected, it is important that Ukraine adapts its strategy, adopts a longer-term approach, and succeeds in many areas. Ukraine has retaken many villages in its territory as part of the offensive and is still steadily gaining territory. The Ukrainian troops are moving towards their goals step by step, with a controlled and slow strategy. Moreover, Ukrainian defenders continue to actively inflict irreparable losses on the army of the aggressor, Russia. The fighters are destroying the enemy in every possible and impossible way. Thank you for watching us.